So the Inspector General looks into it. As the Inspector General says in his letter, quote, "I have determined that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the complaint relating to the urgent concern appears credible. My office's preliminary review indicates that the complainant has official and authorized access to the information and sources referenced in his or her complaint, and that the complainant has subject matter expertise related to much of the material information provided in the complaint. Quote, other information obtained during my office's preliminary review supports the complainant's allegation that, among other things, during that July 25th call, the president, in fact, sought to pressure the Ukrainian leader to take actions to help the president's 2020 re-election bid." Meaning, not only is this serious, not only is the person who brought this complaint a person who is in a position to know of which he speaks, but the Inspector General, with the considerable resources of that office, looked into it and found corroborating information to support the complaint's central allegation about President Trump's behavior. And so there remains considerable controversy as to how this whistleblower complaint was handled after the Inspector General produced this report about it, which will curl your hair, right? The complaint comes into the Inspector General. He looks at it. He spends 2 weeks going through it. He finds that it's credible and corroborated and urgent and lets the Director of National Intelligence know. The handling of this matter thereafter will be controversial for a long time. The Director of National Intelligence was raked over the coals today in the Intelligence Committee as to why he took this urgent and credible and corroborated complaint brought to him by the Inspector General, and instead of giving it to Congress, he brought it to the White House and to the Justice Department. I mean, that controversy is not resolved. The actions of the Director of National Intelligence, the actions of the White House Counsel's Office, the actions of the Justice Department will continue to be scrutinized in this regard. And I think eventually some heads will have to roll in terms of how they blatantly attempted to suppress this whistleblower complaint. But it is out now, and we do know what it says. And we do know that when the whistleblower raised alarms about that presidential phone call with a foreign leader, well, the White House's own notes from that presidential phone call track exactly what the whistleblower was raising the alarm about. That itself speaks to the whistleblower's credibility. Wherever the whistleblower was getting his or her information, it was good information because that person in their complaint basically described exactly what happened in that call. The president did, in fact, contact a foreign country to tell them to take law enforcement action against his potential rival in the 2020 election here in this country. And so that claim by the whistleblower, which started this whole scandal, is corroborated by the White House's own documents. And now, in addition to that central claim, we got all this new information today because we got the whistleblower's complaint. New information about what Trump did and what the Trump White House allegedly did here. And I think the easiest way to get through some of it, while still allowing for the prospect of additional breaking news tonight, which I'm sure we need to allow for, I think the easiest way to maybe get through it is to just focus in on the questions we can now ask in an informed way and the sort of the questions that need answered next and in order. For me, one of the first and most urgent questions we need to ask is, what's going to happen to the whistleblower, right? Part of the controversy around the way this whistleblower complaint was handled is that the White House and the Justice Department under William Barr, they've made this case that this whistleblower actually isn't protected by the federal whistleblower law. So even though whistleblowers are supposed to be protected from being fired or otherwise retaliated against or even prosecuted, if the White House and the Justice Department say, well, yeah, that law doesn't apply to this whistleblower complaint, there's a question as to whether or not that whistleblower may face any of those forms of retaliation or persecution for coming forward. On that point, the Director of National Intelligence did try to give a personal assurance today that as far as he's concerned, the whistleblower should at least be allowed to come forward to Congress.
Director, do I have your assurance that once you work out the security clearances for the Whistleblowers Council, that whistleblower will be able to relate the full facts within his knowledge that concern wrongdoing by the president or anyone else, that he or she will not be inhibited in what they can tell our committee, that there will not be some minder from the White House or elsewhere sitting next to them telling them what they can answer or not answer? Do I have your assurance that the whistleblower will be able to testify fully and freely and enjoy the protections of the law?
Yes, Congressman.
Will the whistleblower be allowed to speak to the intelligence committees about his or her complaint? Well, The DNI says yes. We shall see. Beyond just being allowed to speak to the intelligence committees, will the whistleblower be protected more broadly? And I mean that in a very basic sense, because you may have heard about this today. This is the way President Trump was talking about this matter as of this afternoon at an event in New York City that was closed to the press, despite the fact that this audio leaked out.
But basically, that person never saw the report, never saw the call, meaning never saw the call, heard something, and decided that he or she, whoever the hell it is, sort of like almost a spy. I want to know who's the person that gave the whistleblower, who's the person that gave the whistleblower the information? Because that's close to a spy. You know what we used to do in the old days when we were smart, right? The spies and treason. We used to handle it a little differently than we do now.
That's the president today citing the penalty for treason, which of course is execution, while talking not about the whistleblower himself or herself, but about the people working inside the White House and the U.S. government who provided this whistleblower information for his or her complaint. You know what we used to do in the old days when we were smart, right? The spies and treason, we used to handle it a little differently than we do now. I'm sure the White House will try to pass that off as the president joking around. You can hear from, I don't usually play sound of the president. I put those things in a file marked president says thing. But I think it's worth hearing the actual tone of the president when he made those remarks today to make clear that he plainly was not joking. It's the president threatening today that anybody who gave this whistleblower information that became the basis of this complaint ought to be executed. I mean, let the record show that 2 days ago, the House of Representatives formally announced impeachment proceedings against the president on the basis of this very scandal. I mean, these people that he's talking about, any government officials or White House officials who provided information to the whistleblower who brought this scandal to light, those people are going to be the witnesses in the impeachment proceeding, or they are likely to be prospective witnesses in the impeachment proceeding against the president, which is now underway. Which means that today, this afternoon, as a matter of law, the president was threatening witnesses in the impeachment proceeding against him with death, with execution. And I know the president has said he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and nothing would happen to him for it. We're sort of getting closer and closer to a real-life test of what we all hoped was a hyperbolic anecdote. Under William Barr, it should be noted, the position of the Justice Department right now is not only that the president can't be indicted if he commits a crime, the position of the Justice Department under William Barr is that the president can't even be subject to the criminal process. He cannot even be criminally investigated, no matter what he does or how many people know about it or see him do it. So with the president threatening at this closed press event today that whoever gave this whistleblower information about his own behavior ought to be executed, I mean, for the one thing, that's intimidation of witnesses involved in a federal investigation. That's a crime. Presumably, he believes that he can't, by definition, commit a crime. I mean, not to get too weird, but if the president decided that he knows who those people are who gave the whistleblower information, and he decides he wants to carry out that sentence himself, I mean, would the Justice Department have a problem with that? What if he did it, like, openly on the South Lawn, right? In front of Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, and Bill Barr, the Attorney General. If he's out there killing somebody, right? This is how we deal with spies and treason. What would the Bill Barr Justice Department do with that information? Right? I mean, if the president believes it's okay to threaten the witnesses in the impeachment investigation that has just been launched into him 2 days ago, and the lawyers of the Trump administration are telling him that no matter what he does, he's immune from investigation, let alone prosecution, I mean, the worst case scenario here really is bonkers. But that's what happens when the Justice Department takes the kind of position that it has, and you've got a president like this willing to take advantage of it. The chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Intelligence and Oversight Committees tonight have just released a new statement in response to this threat from the president today. Quote, President Trump is fully aware that our committees are seeking testimony from this whistleblower and others referenced in the whistleblower's complaint released today as part of the House's impeachment inquiry. Our nation's laws prohibit efforts to discourage, intimidate, or otherwise pressure a witness not to provide testimony to Congress. No officials with knowledge relevant to the committee's investigation, including knowledge of the subject of the whistleblower complaint, may be subject to any intimidation, reprisal, or threat of reprisal, and all witnesses must be made available for congressional testimony. The president's comments today constitute reprehensible witness intimidation and an attempt to obstruct Congress's impeachment inquiry. We condemn the president's attacks, and we invite our Republican counterparts to do the same, because Congress must do all it can to protect this whistleblower and all whistleblowers. Threats of violence from the leader of our country have a chilling effect on the entire whistleblower process, with grave consequences for our democracy and our national security. Or in other words, Mr. President, what you just did today, threatening the witnesses, that's another article that we're going to vote on in your impeachment. Congratulations.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.